Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Healy. Some of you will know me from Republic of Work, possibly meeting me on the corridors, wandering around. Of course, anyone who has been in there for whatever essential reasons. We will eventually get back to meeting on a regular basis and snatching proper conversations around coffee machines and on corridors. And when life gets back to normal, it'll be a lot easier to do this in the real world. In the meantime, I am here encased in my little white cage of emotion, where I have been for the last 12 months. And all of you, at least the ones I can see, are in similar little white cages, either in your offices or in your homes. There's lots to kind of get through over the next while. But before we start with the presentation, to just give you a background in case you haven't encountered me before, or you're recognizing the voice and going, I know that voice from somewhere, but I've never seen his ugly face before. My background is in broadcasting primarily. I've been a broadcaster for 24 years at this point, and I have worked with a variety of different organizations. I studied law to begin with in University College Cork. Didn't necessarily want to become a lawyer, so I got sidetracked into journalism when I was involved in the college radio station in UCC. From there, I went to 96 FM and then to a radio station in Dublin called FM 104, then to Sky News, and then to Newstalk, where I spent 10 years as a kind of a full-time presenter, and I'm a part-time fill-in presenter there now. But anyone who's ever worked in broadcasting will tell you that inevitably it is a career that you cannot hang a particular hat on, because eventually you are going to encounter somebody who didn't like you as much as the last person, which is kind of what happened to me, and I exited broadcasting full-time. But that created a new opportunity in itself to set up my own company, which is called Healy Communications, which is involved in PR consultancy and also other elements such as content creation and media training and lots of other bits and pieces. We have 7 people in our team, all of whom are fantastic, many of whom I haven't actually met in the last 12 months. I think I can count 2 on one hand that I would have met at an extreme social distance. It's been a really weird year for everybody, as you can all testify to. I haven't actually been in Marconi House in Newstalk in over 12 months as well, because I've been using the Cork studio in Republic of Work, which is conveniently located, let's put it that way. And I'll be in there again next week. But what we're going to talk about today is the noise. And it is a really, really noisy place, the world at the moment. It was going in that direction anyway, but what has happened is people's expectations have radically changed. Time has become increasingly insignificant in terms of controlling a message and rolling out a message. And, you know, you look at even in the last hour, the last 24 hours and the last hour in particular, AstraZeneca is the '1 story. Everybody's going, oh my God, AstraZeneca, what's going to happen to the rollout? Now Johnson & Johnson put out, well, they haven't put it out, but the FDA are now looking at clots related to Johnson & Johnson, and everybody is kind of panicking and throwing their hands up in the air and getting really stressed. Whereas in reality, the EMA had announced that earlier in the week, but everybody had just forgotten it. So what happens is the world is a very noisy place. And what we're going to talk about over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is how you can possibly penetrate that noise. Because each of you here, from all the lovely people I can see on my screen, I'm not going to name you all, but all of you who are there, you all probably work in businesses that have a story to tell. It's really important that you get that story out there, because if you don't get that story out there, then your business might not necessarily succeed in the way that it should. And equally, you might not necessarily succeed in the business in the role that you're currently in. So whether you're an entrepreneur or working on your own messaging within your organization, let's talk about how you can probably make a bit of a difference over the next little while. So here's the awkward part that I try to share my screen without making an absolute horlicks of it. So bear with me. I'm going to click on that, and you should see that, and you should see that. And Angie, it's up to you to tell me that's working.
On the ball.
There we go. Good work. Angie, you're flying it there. Great input. Thanks for that. So what we're going to talk about in the next little while is how the market has changed. And it has changed radically in the time that I would consider myself to be a young man. But even in the time that I have been involved in media, it has absolutely changed beyond recognition. You know, those, and I'm looking, we've got a decent age mix across the group here, but younger people I'd love to ask you when was the last time you bought a physical newspaper? It might have been some time, because the newspaper has been completely usurped by this fancy device in my hand. And the knock-on effect of that is still only filtering through the entire structure, because when you look at how media used to be funded in the past versus how media is funded now, you start to realize how it has become more difficult to get your message out there using a trusted source. So the first couple of slides here talk about how the media landscape has changed. I should do anyway when I press this button. So this wonderful graph I found years ago is missing the y-axis. But if you can imagine, the y-axis is effectively the date, and it begins around 2000 and runs up to 2018. So as you can see, for the first half of the decade, up till about 2009, 2010, things were kind of going all right. There wasn't a huge issue. There was ups and downs. The blue line there is total morning newspapers. That's everything. The non-red top, which would be your Irish Times, your Irish Examiner, your Irish Independent, that's the green line. And the red top is very conveniently a red line. Something happened around 2009 that we can discuss in more detail that saw those figures starting to drop. As you see, they really did drop there for a while. Sometime around the middle, when the economic recovery started to happen, there was a bit of a bump up again, and then everything started to drive down. Now, bear in mind, this graph stopped about 2 years before COVID-19. Okay, so what you're seeing there is how the share of the newspaper market has dropped quite a lot. Now, what does that mean? It's very plain and straightforward. It means that it's harder for them to generate advertising. So if you look in 2010, the amount of money that those newspapers generated in advertising was about 197 million across the entire portfolio. It's not too bad, as you might say. It's a decent chunk of change. And what that money did was that funded the journalists, that funded the editors, that funded the investigations, that funded the printing presses, it funded the finance, it kept the whole show on the road. Fast forward to 2018, and it was only 147 million came in. So in the course of a couple of years, 25% of the income that those newspapers needed to survive just went pop. It was gone and no more. It has gotten significantly worse, because if we look at 2019, go back. If you look at 2019 as an example, there is no kind of overall figure, because they're being really guarded about this at the moment, because they don't want the advertisers to find out what their actual readership of the physical newspaper is. INM reported a further 7% decline in 2019, and that was before COVID. And if you think about how 2020 went, something happened that kept us all locked in our homes. For Q2 of last year, people were genuinely terrified to leave their houses. As a result, there was a flight of advertising. And I distinctly remember picking up the Irish Examiner at one stage in April last year and scanning through it. And out of the 28 pages in the newspaper, there wasn't a single ad, not one. Okay, so they were effectively working pro bono at the time, which is not good, because they had salaries to pay and they had to keep the show on the road. So the dead tree, as I refer to it, which is the paper-based newspaper, which generates the income still with the big super value and Tesco ads that go into the Sunday newspapers and the daily newspapers, that all kind of dried up for a while. But you might say, well, hang on a second, there is more than one way to skin a particular cat at the moment. Let's talk about my own particular medium of choice, which is radio. In 2009, radio had an 87% reach. Now, that means that 87% of the people in the country listened to radio the day before. It's called the listen yesterday way of measuring. When I started in radio, again, 206 years ago, it was 92. So it went from 92, 24 years ago, to 87 in 2009. And in 2021, 81% of a reach. That's still okay. That means 4 out of every 5 people that you meet listened to the radio yesterday. But more worryingly, from an advertising perspective, that means 20% of the audience that was there is no longer there, or is no longer using your medium to access information or programming, or more importantly, giving advertisers to those radio stations an opportunity to connect with them. If you want to kind of really look into the looking glass, the Dublin figure is down to 75%. So now you're talking about 1 in 4 Dubs don't listen to the radio anymore. Okay, and if you really dive into that, Guess who's not listening to the radio anymore? It's younger demographics, ones that are becoming increasingly valuable to advertisers because they're the ones with more disposable income. So yes, you've got a really loyal fan base, but they're older. And regrettably, as is the nature of demographics, they're starting to die off. And as a result, this new, more mobile grouping are coming in and choosing other ways of getting information. Most likely, again, through this. And you might say, well, look, we still love the radio. Yes, we do. But the question I always ask, and if I was in a room with you, I would say, hands up here, anyone who bought an FM radio, a good old-fashioned FM radio at any stage in the last 12 months. And I guarantee very few hands will go up. 2 years, very few hands will go up. You'd have to go back a while. The last FM radio you probably bought was the one that was in your car. Because most of you now consume radio using smart speakers or phones or whatever the case may be. So radio's in trouble. And they're desperately trying to reinvent themselves, which is why you've got more podcasting coming in and all of that that results. Okay, so into our, let's talk about online. So you say, well, sure, look, the likes of journal.ie, sure, they're flying it. I look at that every day. And yeah, they do. I mean, the numbers that Journal are producing are all kind of decent. So these are the numbers that are quoted on their advertising merchandise, right? 430,000 daily readers, 30 million plus impressions per month, 5 million plus unique visitors. I mean, those are great numbers. If a newspaper was getting them, they would be flying it. They'd be knocking it out of the park in terms of selling advertising to those big advertisers. But the problem is it doesn't necessarily convert. It's harder for the likes of a supermarket to take out a full page banner ad as they would. So if you're flicking between pages on the Journal, you're going to get really annoyed if somehow an ad pops up that you can't get rid of, but in a newspaper just sits there and you have no choice. You might, but everybody, as you know, you do yourself, you're scrolling through the ads. They're less valuable ads to those advertisers, and that's the problem. And the last reported figures they had was 2015. They lost 574,000, which is a sizable chunk of cash for any organization. More recently, they closed Fora.ie, which was their business website. And in the last 12 months, because of the collapse in advertising revenue, they have cut staff numbers and they've made direct appeals for money coming in. So the reason I go through all of that is to show you how much the landscape has changed over the course of the last 2 decades. And there is a reason then that you telling your story on the far side, or you here getting your message heard, is a little bit more challenged. So those of you who have ever met a journalist, slightly weird creatures. I say this with confidence as I used to be one. Journalists are busy people, genuinely very busy people. When you meet a journalist, they're inevitably going to be under pressure. And there's a number of reasons why they're under pressure. They're going to be working on a couple of different stories at the same time. The idea of a hack doing 2 or 3 stories a week is gone. Because no matter what organization they're with, they're going to be doing multiple things. You know, if you take RTE, for example, the RTE journalists that you're watching on the TV news every evening, they have to do radio, they have to do TV, they have to do online. And all of those things have to be kind of written in a different fashion. So therefore, the workload has really dramatically increased for them. And RTE might be an outlier because they haven't really dropped journalist numbers that much. But if you translate that then to somebody maybe in the Independent or the Examiner, they're now filing to online copy. They might be under pressure to meet print deadlines, and they're busy people. And they're working on a number of different stories at the same time. As a result, their attention span is significantly reduced. You basically have to have flames coming out of your ears to attract them to a story, because they know that there's lots of other things they need to do. So if most people, and this is the challenge we come across in PR, we have a great story. We're after reinventing something. Fantastic. What is it? It's the wheel. It's a really good thing. And I'm going, hang on a second, there's already a wheel. The journalist knows there's a wheel. They won't care about your wheel. But no, but our wheel is different. It says it's still a wheel. And that story has to be developed differently, because the journalist will have an attention span that will go, I'm not interested in it. And that's how telling your story becomes more relevant. They're looking for unique content. And the reason they're looking for unique content is it's the good old-fashioned scoop prerogative. If you get a scoop, you get it ahead of all the other journalists, and you get praise for both yourself and your organization. So they're always looking for unique content. They're always going to have someone screaming at them for content to be filed. So in other words, they'll want somebody to kind of respond immediately. So an editor's going, have you got those 500 words written yet? I'm working on that, but you told me to go off and investigate this cat up a tree. Forget the cat up the tree. That's very annoying for them, but that's what happens. And they're more nowadays, they're as likely to ask for photographs as they are for quotes, because guess what? Yes, the photograph might appear with the print version, but that becomes more important as well. It's always good to have a good headshot of yourself, just in case somebody ever asks for it, and they don't go to your Facebook and scrape off the one of you on the night out, looking like you're having a night out. Sometimes it's nice to have a good headshot if there's one available. Okay, what they don't want, oh, hang on, I'm gonna have to stop sharing for a second because there's something gone slightly awry here. Bear with me. See, it was going too well. Right, here we go. Again, what they don't want to be, lads, is they don't want to be messed around. They don't want long-winded conversations about why something is important. Most importantly, they don't want to be ignored. If they're asking a question, they're asking it legitimately, and you don't want to get their back up, because that means they may write a version of the story that you don't want in the public domain. And lastly, they don't want to be called when they're working on another story. Because yes, your story may be of relevance, may be of interest, but they have 3 or 4 other things they need to do before they get to you. And that's not saying that your story is not good enough. It just means you have to have an antenna for when the journalist you're talking to is open to having the conversation. Because again, it might be the most important thing to you at that exact moment in time and to your company, but to that journalist at that exact moment in time, it'll have to wait. And you have to exert a little bit of patience. And that's where kind of PR people like myself would come in and advise you. Sorry, there's okay, we'll come to questions at the end, by the way, if anybody has questions. I know I talk a lot. It's a kind of it's a radio thing. I want to talk about news gathering, because that's important as well in the context of how journalists get their stories. This used to be a lot more relevant. It's going less relevant in the last couple of years for a very obvious reason that we'll get to. There's 3 types of sources. There's a primary source, who would be the likes of verified individuals, officialdom designated spokespeople. So, you know, your elected official, your spokesperson on behalf of a particular company. Like, you know, I mentioned the FDA at the start. The FDA have a spokesperson talking about Johnson & Johnson. So once that person says it, you're green to go. That becomes the story. And if you are an official spokesperson for an organization, you are a primary source of information on their behalf. There are secondary sources as well. So journalists will go, yes, I can print whatever's in the primary column. If I get a contact from a secondary source, I have to go to that primary column to get the information that I need. So secondary sources are the likes of direct contact. So in other words, I've got a story for you. Is it you? No, it's the company I work with. That's a direct contact. The journalist isn't going to go straight with that. They're going to verify it with a primary source. People who were affected, eyewitnesses, elected representatives, the priest, who was the last refuge of the journalist in many horrific tragedies over the years. You'd always go to the priest because the priest will probably talk because he's used to talking. And then there's the one that really destroyed this otherwise beautiful system of news gathering: social media posts. And social media posts are rightly in the second source column here. But because of the way that we have an always on instant gratification news cycle nowadays, social media posts have started to creep in to the primary source column. And I'll give you an example. You know, if Republic of Work, if Frank Brennan burnt his toast, okay, which is, let's face it, not beyond the realms of possibility, and all of a sudden the small bit of smoke that Frank would have generated from his toast fire was drifting out of the window, and somebody was standing at the bottom of Republic of Work and took a photograph up, and it looked like smoke was billowing out of Republic of Work, and tweeted, "Oh, OMG, there's a fire at Republic of Work," okay? About 2 seconds later, that smoke is gone. But that social media post is now in the ether because someone has put it into the ether. And what might very well happen, because there is a rush for news and a desire to be first with the news all the time, some organizations online will now report there are reports of a fire at Republic of Work. Now, this is Frank having burnt his toast and a moment in time where a little bit of smoke was coming out of a window. But the social media post has then become the primary source. So what has happened is that story becomes news before the primary source, i.e. Frank in this case, gets to say, no, there is no fire. I just burnt my toast. So social media posts are a problem. and they're not going to become any less of a problem in the next little while. And then you've got things like tertiary sources, which are random communications. You want to check out Republic of Work, I think there might be a fire there. You're not going to go and publish that until you get to the primary source. Then uninvolved individuals, you should hear what she said about your man, or mother's cousin's aunts. None of that would ever go and be used for a primary source, but you would go to the primary source to then ask a question about it, okay? So the question you have to ask yourself now is, if you are trying to tell a story, in which column do you fit, okay? Because realistically, the green column is what you need to tell the story. You need to be a verified individual. You need to be an official. You need to be a designated spokesperson on behalf of the company. And at that point, then you can start to be trusted by the media as they're looking at you. Okay, so next slide. Story selection. I'll talk more about this in a little while. Story selection is really important. And it's one of the things I've learned, because I'm doing PR for nearly 5 years at this point. I am getting older, and this grey hair is getting much greyer. People always start at the wrong point. And what happens within any organization, and this is almost universal, is that individuals within a company have become so involved with the minutiae and the detail that they can sometimes forget what people on the outside might actually care about. And that could be down to when they're going out to recruit new people. It could be explaining what the company does. My favorite question when I meet any company for the first time is, what do you do? And if you ask that question of 6 or 7 senior executives within an organization, you will get 6 or 7 different answers. And that's where communication starts to go awry, because what has happened is people are in their own silos and they see certain parts of the organization and not others. And that can be a problem, because if you do that, then as a result, you're going to have mixed messaging coming out. So story selection is very important for the person who is selecting the story on behalf of the company. And there's a couple of things you have to kind of worry about in that scenario. The first of which is, how will this story break? Okay, so what I mean by how will this story break is, how are people going to find out about this? That animation is just going to keep going, so I'm just going to ignore it and come to point 2 in a second. How the story is going to break, very simply, is, am I going to break this story? Is this something that I have control over, that I'm going to release at my leisure and send the detail out? Or is this going to be something that's outside of my control, that one of those secondary or tertiary sources are possibly going to get to a journalist before me, and I'm going to have to react and respond? It is much better to control your own message. So how will your story break is really, really important. You have advanced notification of what's coming up, good and bad, within your organization. So you have to ask that question, how is this story going to break? Second of all, what impact is this story going to have? The story may be really important to you. Remember my example of, we've reinvented the wheel. Is that going to have impact outside of this? We've reinvented the wheel that is more environmentally friendly for the motor car. Now there's an added element. So that story has an impact because it has an environmental impact. We're going to create 30 jobs. There you have it. There's an impact. So that's an impact. And that's where people will actually care a little bit about a story. Does it develop an existing story? Okay, back to our wheel analogy. It is going to reduce the carbon footprint of the car. Don't know how it's going to do it. You're just telling me about the wheel. It's going to develop an existing story because everybody cares about more environmentally friendly cars. So therefore, you're developing an existing story and perhaps opening it up to a broader audience. The next question, has it been explained sufficiently? The rock upon which most stories fail. Because you are so ingrained in what you do, and because you are fully immersed in the minutiae, you're probably going to over-explain it. And you're not going to helicopter out to answer that first question. What does it do? Which, if you can't get into a sentence, means you have not explained it sufficiently well. Is there human interest? Now, what I mean by human interest is, will other humans actually care? Or does it impact humans? And that's a really relevant point I'm going to come back to later on. People buy other people, if I can put it that way. They don't buy theory, okay? And a lot of stories get lost purely because you're going to spend 50 minutes talking about what it does and what that bit does and how that's going to have an impact. Whereas you never get to the real crux of it, which is how it's going to make a difference in people's lives, or company's lives, or your competitors' lives, or somebody's life, there has to be that element of the story arc, which I'll come back to in just a minute. Do people care? There's quite a possibility they don't. And that means that you've spent ages building a product. And this is the classic thing that you always hear of companies that go and develop products, and then they realize afterwards that the customer didn't necessarily want that. They wanted something else. But you didn't listen to that, so you kept going with that angle. And as a result, now you're left with a product that nobody cares about. It's the same with stories. Are people going to care about this in any way? Or am I trying to tell a story that won't have an impact? And then there will be days that nothing on God's earth will actually make. When we've had so many of them in the last 12 months, where it doesn't matter how good your story is, it's going to get lost in the tide of all the other stuff that goes on. And we'll come back to story in a little while and how you can tell the story in a better way. But a story always has a story arc. And the story arc is a very simple thing. It's identify a problem, talk about its impact, and provide a solution. That's the story arc. Every story that you tell has to have that journey. Okay? If you're a company that's developing a product, you're doing it for a reason. Okay? And that's the impact part. Okay? So we've created an environmentally friendly wheel. The impact of this is going to be better for the environment, and every company in the world is going to want one because the human cares about it. And the solution is it's something to do with the type of air that we put into the wheel. There's a story arc, okay? And people find relevance in that. The one thing I was taught at the very beginning when I was a journalist is you always have to tell the story. It is so simple and straightforward, but people forget this. The story has to have a start, a middle, and an end. You cannot begin at the end of the story and expect somebody to understand the start. Equally, you cannot begin in the middle. You always have to tell it in such a way that people get it. And you never presume intelligence on the part of the person who is listening to that story. So what you have to do when you're telling the right story is you have to examine that story arc and ask, is it right? One of the most important lessons that I learned was when I moved to FM 104 in Dublin, which would be a pretty big radio station that people are familiar with if you've ever been in Dublin. It had a really big newsroom, and I moved up from Cork thinking I was the best thing since sliced pan. Many of you won't remember Charles Mitchell, but I remember growing up in awe of Charles Mitchell reading the news on RTE. And I was fully convinced I was the second coming of Charles Mitchell and I was going to be great. But of course, within a couple of days, the deputy news editor pulled me to one side and told me I was terrible and I was doing it all wrong, which led to me having then to ask, well, how am I doing it all wrong? What am I doing? She said, well, you are doing it all wrong. You're reading the news. And this hugely confused me because my job description quite literally on the tin said, your job is that of newsreader. So I followed through her logic, through gritted teeth. I said, well, what should I be doing? I said, well, you should be telling the story. And you should be telling the story in such a way that it is understood. And the best way to do that, she said, was to use a very simple methodology. And it was to have two people in mind and two people only when you're telling that story. And the two people she had were the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a hairdresser in Ballymun. It wasn't to denigrate either profession, but what she was trying to impart was this person is extremely well-read, capable of critical thinking, can understand anything that you throw at her. This person may have dropped out of school at 15, does not necessarily understand the workings of the world, but is entitled to understand your story. But whatever story you're telling, they both have to understand it. Okay? If you get the judge and not the hairdresser, you've done it wrong. If you get the hairdresser and not the judge, you've done it wrong. If you really make a hash of it, you'll miss both of them. But the good news is, if you get the judge and the hairdresser, you're going to get everybody else who's in the middle. Okay? And that's really important because no matter who you're trying to communicate with, they're in that audience. And sometimes you get people in the corporate world saying, but you know what? I really only want the judge. I don't get the hairdresser. They're not my market. I don't like, I mean, I don't even get my own haircut. Why would I bother telling that person? And you'd be surprised at how common that perception is out there. And the answer I always give to that is, that's fine. The day that you're telling your story, the judge isn't listening, but the hairdresser is. And the following day, the judge goes to get his haircut. You've missed the opportunity to tell the story because it could have come up while they were sitting in the hairdresser's chair. So there you have that big audience that's around you, and you have to pass through somebody to get out there, because this is where marketing and PR kind of diverge. So the opportunity for you guys who are, you have your story ready to tell, and there's the audience between the judge and the hairdresser. The options for you right now to tell the story would be to go up to them individually, tell them who you are, and go on about your story. That's a little time consuming, which isn't great. You can do marketing, which companies are really, really good at. The problem with marketing is it's you telling everybody how great you are, which is what people expect you to say. You're hardly going to tell them that the product that you've spent your life working on is crap. So there is an expectation to a certain degree that marketing is blurb. It'll get you to a certain point, but it lacks credibility. Where PR comes in is PR is getting someone else to independently validate the message for you, which brings us back to the first part of the presentation that I've been talking about here, which is the journalist. So those publications that have found it difficult in the last little while to fund themselves are a really important part of the storytelling process. Because if I say something, that's kind of like, of course you're going to say that. But if I say something to a reporter from the Irish Independent or the Irish Examiner, and they post it on the website and the newspaper, it's no longer me just saying it. It is them having run the rule over it, validated the story, and put it to the market where it can be found. And that's the difference between marketing and PR. Marketing is very effective. PR is getting somebody else to validate that marketing message for you. So you're there. There's the judge and the hairdresser. You have to pass through me. And I am the medium, technically. So in other words, your storytelling has to pass through me for me to tell them. It is a fantastic part of the process. It's where journalists do exercise a little bit of power, but it's where you have a dichotomy that doesn't serve people well. So when any of you, I don't know if, and forgive me if I've ever interviewed you, I do apologize, and I'm a terrible person, and you're right to hold it against me. But when people engage in an interview, what normally happens is they might meet the journalist. In the current environment, it will be virtually. Sometimes when we get to meet humans again, this might happen. And you'll meet them, and you'll have a very polite and pleasant conversation with them. And what will happen is, you'll be like this, and you'll talk about COVID, and you'll talk about the weather, and the kids going back to school, and da. And you won't think any less of them, and they won't think any less of you. But what will happen then is they will turn on a tape recorder, or they will turn on a microphone. And all of a sudden, something weird happens to the power dynamic, where previously you were like this, now you've started to drift. And all of a sudden, this person, the journalist, is in charge, and this person is following their lead. And this is a really damaging power demographic that happens all the time. And this person then will go away, having answered the questions that were asked, and someone will say, "What did you say?" And they'll go, "I haven't a clue. I think I mentioned something about cats." And it'll be very confusing for that person, because they went in with reams and reams of paper learnt off, going, "Oh God, I never got to say this." And it's the ultimate buyer's regret that people have after doing interviews. But the reason that happens is because they are letting it happen. Their brain is conditioned to this being an interview, because in their mind, there's no difference between the journalist doing the interview and a 16-year-old going for their first job in a Centra. I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to answer them. Ask, answer, retreat. It's a power dynamic that doesn't serve well. Sometimes people come in here, and I traditionally say, elderly gentlemen or older gentlemen, they'll talk down to the interviewer. Pure disaster. They're just going to talk down to the audience. What everybody needs to do when they're approaching any kind of interview is to keep it here, to keep it at a peer-to-peer conversation. It's not an interview. That's the most important thing I always scream at people. You are not doing an interview as you traditionally think of it. You're having a conversation with someone else that others are going to happen to hear. And in that, your job is to make sure that you select the right message to communicate. And that's where we apply what's called the rule of three. And the rule of three is a very simple rule that states you pick the three things that you want to communicate with, and you get them in early to the conversation. So what you're doing is you're telling the person on the far side what you want to talk about. And as it emerges later on, then you're going to have somewhere else to go. You'll always have something to talk about because you've already established them. But this person might know absolutely diddly squat about your business. Diddly squat. And you know everything about it, but you're letting them dominate the conversation. So the rule of three states you get your messages in, the ones you've carefully chosen that you want people to remember, you get them into the conversation early. And what you do then is you keep reinforcing them. And kind of making sure that people remember them, because the most important thing you want out of the exercise is to be remembered. It isn't that you're going to tell them about the intricacies of the wheel. It's that it's a more environmentally friendly wheel. Okay, and it's easy to get lost in that, and maybe the question might drag you down a rabbit hole that you didn't want to talk about. But you have to remember that you're making your points, and you have to make them. You have to reinforce them, and that's why you need to condense your message down. Okay, it's not like a presentation at a board meeting or somewhere where you've got loads of time. You have to squash it. Remember, the journalist has a very limited attention span. They need to be brought to the thing that you're trying to tell them quickly. They appreciate brevity. They hate long-windedness. And a journalist, when they're listening to you, they're always looking for the line. What's the line? What's this person telling me that I'm going to write about? And the problem is, for most people, they don't think about that in advance. They've got so much detail in front of them, they can't even pick out the line themselves. And that's why you need to establish your story early. You need to tell them, this is why this is interesting. This is the shiny bit that you're attracted to. And most importantly, people remember stories, not theory. Have to drive that home. And the best way to tell a story is a story that people will remember. Okay, you don't remember going to bed as a child, but you will remember the stories that your parent told you in the bed. Okay, and that's the truth. Like, the mundane things are going to get glossed over, but they'll remember the stories. It's the same here. Remember the story arc. Identify the problem. Talk about the impact. Come up with a solution. That's the story arc that they need to hear, and you need and bring them on the journey with you. Remember, you have more information on the topic than they ever will have, and you have to use that power well and not overuse it. And the important thing here is you need to be remembered, because there's lots of people who are going to tell a story, but the story hasn't been thought through. Or what has happened is the raison d'etre, the reason they set up the company or the business in the first place, has become lost and mired in a load of other things, and they forget that. That's still the reason why you're talking to them. Okay, and like, if you're talking about Stripe, for example, fantastic story out of Limerick, Tipperary via Limerick. It's easy to kind of talk about the value of the company now and how the kids grow. They still have a core product that they have developed and expanded upon, and that's still the story. And that's the story that's worth telling. To talk a little bit about deadlines, and I have to just point out the clip art on this particular slide is a thing of beauty. It is, I think, from Microsoft 95, and it's still going there. The sand is still flowing through. God, may it last forever. I really do like it. There's no such thing as a real deadline anymore, because what happens, as we discussed earlier on, stuff breaks on social media. It doesn't have any background anymore. And as a result, controlling that message can become a little trickier. So that's why it's always better to be a couple of steps ahead of this. Plan things out. Make sure that the message, the story arc you've identified, the message that you're telling, you've thought it through. You don't just you're not responding on the hoof, or you're not going, crap, that's after getting away from me now, and I could have controlled that a bit better. You have to be careful of fake news, because, again, looking at social media, it is riddled with stuff that is basically not true, and you have to then sometimes make a decision on, do I respond to it or do I ignore it because it's so obviously fake? It's really, really difficult sometimes, but always my favorite phrase that I use amongst my own team is borrowed from the world of clothing manufacturing, which is measure twice, cut once. I think carpenters use it as well, to be fair. Always kind of stop for a second, think, then stop again, and then talk. If you're told of a deadline, do respect it, though, because when you're dealing with those really kind of busy and stressed journalists that we talked about earlier on, and they say, I need something by 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock doesn't cut it, because they're then either going to drop the story or put out a version that you don't want. It's very important in the context of broadcast. Again, as somebody who's worked in broadcast for most of my career, if you're told to answer the phone at 11 o'clock, do not think that you can avoid answering the phone at 11 o'clock. In the context of, you're told you have to log on to a certain browser. Don't wait until the time you're supposed to be doing the interview to download the browser, because that means you're going to delay the person on the far side and probably piss them off, which is the last thing you want to do. And remember as well, a lot of the time you might say, well, I wasn't ready to tell that story, or crikey, that's after getting out now. That broke in a way that it didn't want. Sometimes a holding statement is better than silence, particularly in the current environment. Silence becomes all-consuming, because what happens, the void is being filled by a lot of other things outside of your control. The example I use out of this is I think it was an Intel plant, but one big factory, tech factory up in Kildare, was closing because they'd stopped making whatever giggling pin that they were using. A couple hundred people were going to be impacted by this. And as usual, the unions were told the night before, we've an all points meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30. They're normally a bad sign. I think anyone who works at a big company would appreciate that. So what had happened was, this had gotten out, the unions had leaked it, it was on the 9 o'clock news and RTE, there was a big panic going, oh my God, this company is closing, there'll be loads of people out of jobs, panic. And it's kind of a stressful scenario, because if the decision is made to close the factory, that's a thing. And what happened was the following morning, then Morning Ireland, Newstalk breakfast was full of breathless local councillors going, and we need to do this, and we need to establish task forces, and we need to do this. And all of the time, the company were going, we need to talk to our employees. And we need to tell them what's going on, because they're actually the important ones here. But what had happened was that void was being filled by a lot of loud voices. Empty vessels sometimes make the loudest noise. They might have no affiliation or understanding of the situation, but they're being asked to comment. And guess what the media is doing? The media is going to hoover all of that up. Sometimes they have a real relevance. I'm not saying that politicians don't, but a lot of the time politicians get a call because there's no one else talking. Company isn't talking. There's no one officially on the record. So what they did in this particular factory was a guy who worked in PR for a number of years, really good guy, walked down from the building to where the journalists had assembled, and they were trying to get people going in to ask them how they felt about something they didn't know about yet. And he handed out a single sheet of A4 paper to all the journalists who were there. And this sheet of paper said, we are currently meeting with our staff, and a full statement will follow afterwards. And almost instantly, the tone changed of the media coverage from this breathless, oh, what's going to happen, to staff are currently being briefed by management on the outcome of this particular process. And that one simple holding statement basically put out the flame that was underneath. Didn't change the story, but what it changed the way it was being covered. And again, that's a very important thing to remember. The dangers of clickbait, I showed up here purely because it's becoming an increasingly big problem, again, courtesy of our friend, Mr. Mobile Phone. Clickbait is non-justified editorial content, i.e. nonsense, but the numbers clicking through from social media make it relevant. And the logic here goes back to the earlier part of the conversation. More clicks equals more visitors equal more revenue. Okay, and you might be wondering what I'm talking about here. It's the classic, you won't believe what X has done. You really don't care about X. You may have once cared about X. You might have maybe bought an album of X at one stage. But geez, what's he after doing now? And you click on it. And what happens is that brings you to a website that has advertising on it. And sometimes the advertising is very cleverly placed that you might accidentally click on that. And that then tells the advertiser, oh, look, the clickbait has worked. And you then effectively have become the product. Another classic would be, and they do this the whole time, 5 restaurants closed due to hygiene scare. Now, this is just the way the FSAI sometimes do things. And their press release is normally very accurate, detailing where these restaurants are and what kind of hygiene scare they have. But the headline is there, and you're going to go, Christ, is that the place where I bought my dinner from last night? And all of a sudden, you're clicking through to that frantically out of a prurient interest as to what it is. But the reason why those stories are constructed in the way they are is so that people will follow through. They really then don't have credibility because people are a little bit wiser to this, but that doesn't stop them clicking through. The real risk, though, is it can be very damaging to a brand. And what I find fascinating about a lot of apps, like even Sky News app, they use this outbrain advertising, which, like, you're there reading Sky News about the latest on COVID from a trusted, reliable source, and underneath it then there's either an ad for earwax or telling you that bananas can clear your colon. And I'm sitting there going, lads, what are you doing? You're mixing up two very different things here. The banana thing doesn't work, and the earwax thing is just too disgusting to have ever clicked on. But what happens is that clickbait can be quite damaging. And and my favorite one that keeps coming up on the Sky News one is 27 reasons why you shouldn't shop at Aldi. And I have no idea Why that is, I'd love to know the rationale of identifying a single brand and why Aldi haven't completely freaked out at this and taken legal action to shut it down. They probably keep doing it. It's like whack-a-mole. It just keeps popping up all over the place. So it can be quite damaging to brands. And then the other thing you need to be careful of, and this has become an increasing problem, if you're ever telling a story or you're front of house for any particular reason, anonymity used to come much easier to the world. We used to all be able to kind of hide in plain sight and didn't necessarily have to follow through. Sometimes if you are telling a story or putting yourself forward for an interview, just identify, is there anything on my social media that I'm not happy with? Is there an image there that might be a little old that I don't want to be associated with anymore? There's lots of examples that we could go through. The most recent of which was social media that was trawled for somebody who got a very senior state job and they'd lost it within hours because of comments that they'd put up years ago. Sometimes journalists, in investigating an individual, go, "No, he looks like an interesting chap. We'll click on your social media." And if there's something there that looks a bit dodge, that might impact the likelihood of the story landing, or worse, again, becomes part of the story. And all of a sudden, the story, that the happy clappy story that you were pushing out there, means that it sometimes gets lost. So the question you have today is, in this slightly crazy world that had the last 12 months has become a little mad, what can we do if we're looking to get heard? The most important thing is prepare your message. Again, going back to the point I made earlier on, it isn't what am I saying? It's why would I want anyone to remember what I'm saying? The memorable parts of your story are what you need to prepare, and condense that down into a soundbite, into a single sentence that all of a sudden you can expand upon. And when you identify those three things, like ideally you should have 3 words that tell your story. And each of those 3 words kind of unlock Pandora's box in your own head that you can then go on and explain in more detail what it is. Ask questions before someone else does. What do I mean by that is you have to interrogate your own story. Okay, think about the story angles that go out there. Is there a negative here that I haven't thought about? Could this be challenged by somebody in a way that would be hard for me to defend? Is there a bit of a pothole that I could fall into when telling my story that ultimately would undo the good of what I was trying to do? So again, measure twice, cut once. Very simple. Look at the wider agenda. Does my story fit into a wider picture? Is there kind of an issue that you want to kind of address as part of that wider agenda? Could it further a story, or are you breaking new ground here that will be worthwhile? Or is there something that has happened and you go, hang on a second, we're good at that. We've solved that problem already for another client. So therefore we can contribute to this story and make it relevant. As I said, pause and think, which is measure twice, cut once. And most importantly, don't speak first and regret it later. It's very hard to put the bunny back in the hat. My rationale always in public relations is the first version that's out there tends to stick. And that's a double-edged sword, because if you've thought through your messaging and what it is, then that's a good thing, because once your first message gets out there, that's the one that tends to stick. But at the same time, if you get it wrong, or if you somehow fudge it thinking that you're doing the right thing, and then later on you're looking at it going, crap, I didn't mean to do that. And like, one of the big problems is that you come out with a negative message that creates an expectation of failure. That's a real problem, and I'll finish on this before we kind of throw it open to questions. Is one of the biggest challenges that any company will have in the last 12 months is it's been absolutely awful for everybody. I mean, we had to completely upend how we do things. Nothing made sense anymore. All of our plans and projections went to pot. And it's going to be very easy to talk about the things that went wrong. But the success comes from not talking about the things that went wrong, but the things that are going to go right in the future. You very rarely progress by looking over your shoulder. Yeah, things happen there that you remember, but if you keep looking over your shoulder, you're not looking forward. And That's really important when it comes to messaging as well. Yeah, it was terrible for your company, but it was terrible for everybody. What I want to know from your story is, how's it going to make things better in the future? Not what happened in the past. So I think that's a really important point on which to finish. I think that is the end of my slide presentation thingamajiggy. It is indeed. So I'm going to exit out of that, hopefully. Crud. Hang on, stop share. There we go. And I can see all your lovely faces again, so that's good. So folks, that is my presentation. I see there's some chats after coming in there, so I'll have a look at that there. From Ronan, who's there. Jonathan, journalists also want to be respected, not micromanaged, and definitely never asked to see the content before it's posted. Yes, Ronan, 100% right. Because what happens is journalists are really, really protective of their stuff. Okay, and like, you know, their content is really relevant and important to them. So if you ask for content in advance, they're going to go, no, because you're going to want to change it. And even with that, like having done so many years in radio, you'll have somebody who's really nervous going, can I listen to it before it goes out? And my answer every single time was absolutely not. Because A, you're going to hate the sound of your own voice, because nobody likes how they sound. It's inevitable that you're going to hate the sound of your own voice. And then you're going to go, I didn't really mean to say that. Can I edit that out? It's like, no, you can't, because that's just nonsense. That you said what you said. So you have to you have to trust them. But that's why it's important to front load all that work and prepare your messaging in advance. Joe's a wise person. Be more like Joe, says Ronan. Well done, Joe. I agree wholeheartedly. Stick to deadlines is very important as well, says Joe. And I think that's dead right. Has anyone got any questions that they want to kind of ask me directly there before we hop off? I'm just conscious of time. And I've talked a lot, so I need to drink tea.
Jonathan, hi, Amy Norton here.
Hi, Amy.
I just wanted to ask, hi, how are you? I just wanted to ask, in terms of, okay, say you're just about to go on the market with a product, how soon or how far away in the build up to that launch would you start engaging with broadcasters and journalists?
Obviously it depends on the product, right? But again, your story arc, you probably have a very well developed story arc as it is, because if you like, it depends. We're back to that classic. Have you gone to customers and have you established with customers that yes, there is a market for this? So if you've done that, then you're already well on the way to a story arc. So you've identified the problem, you've talked about the impact, and you're presenting the solution. With new businesses in particular, there's a hesitancy amongst journalists to speak to somebody who hasn't got some miles on the clock. So in other words, if you don't have your launch clients, if you haven't tested it in market, if it's an app, who's using the app? Have you got people signed up to it already? So you need to kind of pass that test where it's moved from theoretical to real world. And once it's real world, then the journalist will pay attention. If it's prior to that, they'll be a little bit more reluctant.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
But to be fair, it's good. Always think about that. When I'm going to tell the world about this, that story, the arc isn't going to change, but the words that you use to describe it probably will evolve. But always remember the genesis of what you're doing. That's the one thing to hold on to. Whatever the genesis of the product or the idea is, that's still what's driving you on. And don't be afraid to talk about that. Like every time, like Steve Jobs was the best communicator for technology, I think, that the world has ever seen. And he always kept it painfully simple. I mean, even last night, I watched Reeling in the Years for 2010. And like he was explaining the concept of the iPad, which has become so universal to all of our lives. And the basic pitch he had standing up in front of 800 absolute Apple nuts who would have, if he actually presented an apple, they would have bought it. But what he was saying was, we felt for a long time there was something that sat between the iPhone, between the smartphone and the laptop. Here's the iPad. And like I was sitting there going, straight away, everybody, without even seeing what the iPad was, knew what the iPad was. So, that kernel, always hold on to that, because that's important.
All right, thank you.
Just a question, Jonathan. It was very.
Hi, Kathy.
What do journalists love, or maybe easier to say, what they don't love, what they don't?
as I said, they don't like to be monkeyed around, is probably the easiest way of describing it. So, if you're going to it, have it thought through and that it's there. Like, there are different types of journalists doing different things. So, you've got, you'll have science editors, you'll have business correspondents, you're going to have health correspondents. So it depends on, if you have something that is specific to a sector, then that specific organization, that specific correspondent might do it. Sometimes it's general stuff, where there are general reporters that you can pitch to. I mean, somebody's making the point again, Joe. Joe is very knowledgeable. I don't know where Joe is. I'm giving Joe a wave there. They love clarity. There's Joe. Hi. Are they real lollipops? That's the question. But yeah, she's dead right. They love clarity, which is why, using a firm like ours, like what we prioritize always before we go to a journalist is we write the story out. We a press release has all the contingent elements of the story that the journalist will need. Now, they come back and they'll ask questions. But for the most part, a well-written release will always contain all the information that they need for the story. And like everything else, journalists like an easy life. They like, if they can understand, we're going back to this part of the conversation. If they understand it, they will pass on the information to their audience. So again, clarity is very important. But most important, like, they don't want half-baked ideas. They want the full cake.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, I don't know, Angie, are you still there?
I'm still here. If anyone else has any questions, now is your time. Otherwise, I think we will call it a day.
Forever hold your
Thanks
peace.
so much, Jonathan. Pardon?
It's like being at a wedding. Speak now or forever hold your peace. But no, look, as I said, guys, the thing is, we will eventually get back into Republic of Work, which will be lovely, that we get to actually talk to each other and meet each other. In the meantime, it's Jonathan at healycommunications.ie if anybody wants to kind of drop me an email, or if you have any question, no matter what part of the journey that you're on. Look, startups, the advice that was always given to me, and again, you're all at different stages in your journeys, the advice given to me when I started in PR was always be nice to startups, because you never know which one of them is going to work out as being the next big thing. And it was a very, very solid advice that I still stick to. So I'm always there as an interested ear to any story that you might have out there. So don't be afraid to reach out.